Okay, pull up a line that's practically burned into pop culture history. Greed is good.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that from the film Wall Street? It really became like the unofficial slogan of the 1980s.
It absolutely did, yeah. And, while you might think of it just as a movie quote or something, stuck in a specific era,
Right.
the research we're digging into today argues that this idea isn't just history. It's something deeply, deeply ingrained in American society, and honestly, it has some pretty serious, often hidden consequences.
Right. So this deep dive is all about pulling from some really insightful sources.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at excerpts from a book and related research that unpack the whole idea of greed and a related concept they call maximization, and how these connect directly to deviance and crime, and importantly, how this plays out particularly among the powerful, within elite groups and inside major corporations here in the U.S.
Exactly. Our mission for you today, as we kind of go through these sources together, is to get a handle on why greed seems to be so widely accepted, maybe even celebrated sometimes. How that links up with crime that often goes completely under the radar, and, well, what the very real impacts are for you, the listener, in your everyday life.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Let's unpack that greed is good moment. The sources place it squarely in the context of the 1987 movie Wall Street, right? Noting how it just exploded in popularity during a time when corporate greed wasn't just happening, it was genuinely being cheered on.
And it's worth taking a second to really look at how the sources define greed itself. They call it a selfish and excessive desire for more of something as money than is needed, or excessive or rapacious desire, especially for wealth or possessions. What's really striking here is that conventionally, greed is a negative term.
Totally.
It's a deadly sin in many traditions, yet somehow in the U.S. it became, well, acceptable, even admirable to some.
Yeah, you hear people call that period the me decade or even the greed decade.
Why?
The sources note that during the 80s and 90s, self-concern and personal survival really became the driving force. And interestingly, they point out that a pro-business administration at the time seemed to contribute to this, making the pursuit of wealth, even excessive wealth, feel almost moral.
And to give you a really concrete example straight from the sources, look at the case of Michael Milken. He was the king of high-yield bonds, or junk bonds.
Oh, yeah.
He was convicted of multiple securities violations, pleaded guilty to 6 felonies, including unlawful security transactions, tax fraud, and insider trading.
And the sources highlight that when he was doing this, he already had immense wealth.
Yeah.
He absolutely fit that definition of excessive desire for more than is needed. So what was the outcome?
Well, he got a prison sentence, initially 10 years, but it was reduced to just 2 by the same judge, partly because he helped with other investigations.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The sources mention that even after his conviction, an editorial in the New York Times actually justified some of his activities.
You're kidding.
No. Arguing that his work ultimately helped many Americans achieve greater wealth through investments.
Wow. As if that weren't wild enough. After getting out, Milken went on to teach a business course at UCLA. Today, he's a multi-billionaire, one of the richest people on the planet. Later, the SEC brought charges alleging he participated in the securities industry after being banned.
Right.
He paid back money, but faced no further punishment. So the sources conclude, the Milken case in a way shows how greed is good, remains justifiable, even celebrated within the context of the American dream.
Okay, so we've set the stage with the acceptance of greed. Let's connect this to the idea of crime itself. When most people think about crime, they usually picture violent street crime, robbery, assault, burglary, things like that.
But the data tells a completely different story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
FBI statistics consistently show that the vast majority of crime reported every year is actually property crime.
Yeah.
And the most common type within that, simple theft. Millions of reported incidents every single year.
What's particularly fascinating, and frankly a little surprising from the sources, is a study they mention about professional criminologists, the experts who study crime for a living.
Oh, really? What did they find?
Well, this study, affiliated with the American Society of Criminology, found that a significant percentage of these experts admitted to engaging in various criminal and deviant behaviors themselves.
Seriously? Like what?
Yeah, we're talking 66% for drunk driving, 60% for illicit drug use, 55% for theft, 19% for tax fraud, even small percentages for physical assault or burglary.
Wow. So the people studying crime.
Exactly. The point the sources make is clear. Even highly educated professionals who study crime admit to a whole range of deviant and criminal acts.
Mm.
This leads the sources to a pretty crucial conclusion. Crime and deviance, even serious forms, are actually quite normal, even among the people who study it. And this isn't just about individual behavior. Think about corporate crime. We've known this is normal for a long time. Edwin Sutherland's classic research found that every single major corporation he studied back in the day had broken the law, many of them repeatedly.
And chillingly, according to these sources, corporate crime is considered even more widespread today.
Yeah. So the implication is huge, right? If criminality is this normal, especially within contexts like the corporate world, then theories that focus only on explaining crime as something abnormal, something caused by like head injuries or severe childhood abuse, for example,
Uh-huh.
they can't possibly explain the vast bulk of crime that's actually happening. It forces us to look at crime not just as individual pathology, but as something that can be embedded in societal structures and cultural norms.
And when we talk about corporate crime, we're not talking about penny ante stuff. The financial damage is absolutely staggering.
Oh, completely. Street property crime might cost millions per year across the country. White-collar and corporate crime, the sources put the annual cost in the hundreds of billions.
Hundreds of billions.
Yeah, just running through some numbers the sources cite. Securities and commodities fraud estimated at $40 billion a year. Check fraud, $10 billion. Telemarketing fraud, another $40 billion. Consumer fraud, a whopping $190 billion.
Wow.
Insurance fraud, $85 billion. Healthcare fraud, $80 to $100 billion. And get this, unnecessary medical tests costing hundreds of billions per year. The sheer scale completely dwarfs street crime losses.
That's hard to even wrap your head around. But it's not just about the money, is it? The sources introduce a concept called corporate violence.
Right. This is different from street violence because it's indirect. It's the death, injury, or illness that happens as a result of corporate policies, practices, or actions.
So not like direct intent necessarily.
Exactly. What's important to understand is the difference in how it occurs. Street murder is usually intentional. Corporate violence often comes from negligence, recklessness, or simply knowing behavior that proceeds despite the risk, rather than a direct intent to kill. But, as the sources starkly put it, even with that difference, the victims are just as dead.
And the numbers are truly shocking when you compare them. In a typical year, you might see around, 16,000 murders in the U.S.?
Yeah, that.
But the sources reference estimates of hundreds of thousands of deaths annually, from things like occupational diseases caused by unsafe workplaces, pollution, unnecessary surgeries, hazardous products.
Yeah. One reference puts the total at over 400,000 per year. That comparison is simply horrifying.
It really is.
Now, it's fair to point out, as the sources do, that sometimes victims of elite deviance played a role. Smokers chose to smoke, people choose to eat fast food, for example.
Sure, but the sources address this head on,
Yes.
right? By drawing a parallel to street crime.
Exactly. If someone leaves their car unlocked and it's stolen, or stays in an abusive relationship and is assaulted, we don't usually say, well, it's their fault, let's excuse the thief or the abuser. The sources argue that the same logic should apply to corporations. They often spend billions on advertising specifically designed to heavily influence choices for products they know are harmful.
So if the scope is this large, and the costs are this high, financial and human, why does it happen? Where does this come from?
Well, the sources tie it back significantly to strain theory and the American dream. That intense cultural emphasis in the U.S. on material success creates enormous pressure and strain on everyone.
Okay, and building on that, the sources bring in Messner and Rosenfeld's institutional enemy theory.
Right. Their core argument is that in the U.S., the economy isn't just an important institution, it's the most important one. It ends up dominating other areas of life like family, education, and even the political system.
And how does that actually look?
Well, you see this dominance in practical ways, the sources point to. Things like low pay for childcare shows how family is devalued. Education often gets narrowly focused on just preparing people for jobs, accommodating the economy. The primary purpose of government itself can become seen as simply promoting economic growth, again, devaluing the political sphere's other roles. Families sacrifice time together for work. Schools have to sell products to raise money. Politicians depend on corporate donations. It's pervasive.
And this relentless prioritization of the economy, according to the sources, directly interferes with quality of life.
Absolutely. They point out that the U.S. is the only advanced industrial democracy without things like paid family leave, national health care for everyone, or extended family vacation policies required by law. And they argue this contributes to unnecessary deaths compared to peer nations.
Hmm. There's a debate the sources touch on, though, about whether Americans are exceptionally materialistic compared to other nations.
Yeah, some survey data might suggest not, with many Americans actually agreeing that less emphasis on money would be good.
But the authors counter strongly by looking at behavior, right? Not just stated opinions.
Exactly. Long work hours, sacrificing family time, and the very fact that so many people feel there's too much emphasis on money, that behavior and feeling points pretty clearly to a significant problem with materialism and economic dominance in the U.S.
Okay. The sources also fold in Cloward and Olin's idea of differential opportunity.
Right. So this isn't just about having access to legitimate ways to succeed, like getting a good education or a promotion. It's also about access to illegitimate opportunities.
Ah.
Succeeding through crime or deviance also requires learning certain skills and having access to those opportunities, just like legitimate success does.
And critically, the sources emphasize people aren't always sticking to just one path. People can and do use both legitimate and illegitimate means simultaneously to pursue success.
Yeah, you can work a completely legal job and at the same time engage in deviant or criminal behavior to get ahead or make more money.
This is where the author's own theory, contextual enemy strain, really adds something, according to the sources.
Exactly. They focus on how specific contexts, like the corporation itself, create additional pressures on top of the American dream's pressure to achieve through maximization.
Maximization again, so inside a company.
Inside a company, maximization becomes the driving force, influenced by the specific opportunities available, the social controls, or lack thereof, within the company, the demand for loyalty, and the ideology pushed by executives.
Because think about what a corporation fundamentally is. The sources describe them as entities designed for unlimited acquisitiveness.
Right. They even use the term ataphoristic, which essentially means they are indifferent to right and wrong unless it affects the bottom line, profit or loss.
Yeah.
They don't inherently have a built-in social good principle.
And there's a legal basis for this, too.
Yeah, a classic legal case, Dodge v. Ford from 1916, is cited to illustrate this. The court actually ruled that a business corporation exists primarily for the profit of its stockholders. Yeah. Trying to run it primarily to benefit others at the expense of that profit was seen as legally questionable, almost illegal, under the principle of acting in the best interests of the corporation.
So this means corporate morality becomes less about personal ethics and more about organizational goals.
Pretty much. Individuals working for a corporation often feel pressured to set aside their personal morals and act for the corporation's goals, primarily maximizing profit, regardless of how it's done.
The sources explain that the very structure of the corporation can constrain or seduce managers.
Yeah, it pushes them to prioritize profit, sometimes even when they know it's harming people.
Hmm.
Corporate morality can end up being simply what the guy above you expects from you.
Wow.
Loyalty to the company and to those above you becomes crucial for advancing your career. Maximization is learned and reinforced within this specific corporate culture.
And this creates a kind of enemy within the company, a conflict between an individual's personal morals and the intense pressure to achieve the corporation's goals.
Exactly. Usually profit maximization. This conflict, within that corporate context, actively promotes deviant and criminal behavior.
And this brings us back to that earlier finding the sources highlighted. Corporate criminals are often not some distinct class of people.
Right. They can be quite similar to seemingly respectable individuals. This really supports the idea that crime isn't just limited to a few bad apples. It can be a normal part of and even embedded within corporate structure and culture.
Even if they have traits like conscientiousness.
Interestingly, yes. While some studies point to traits like risk-taking or narcissism, others also include conscientiousness among corporate offenders. It's complex.
A huge factor enabling this corporate deviance and crime, according to the sources, is simply weak social controls.
Definitely. Compared to street crime, the regulation and enforcement around corporate behavior are significantly weaker. The likelihood, the certainty of getting caught and punished is much, much lower.
Why is that?
Well, law enforcement agencies often just don't have the resources, the specific expertise, or sometimes even the legal jurisdiction needed to effectively investigate and prosecute complex corporate crimes.
Plus, businesses often end up regulating themselves, which, surprise, surprise, tends to benefit their own interests more than the public's.
And the sources point to this revolving door phenomenon. Regulators frequently leave government agencies to take high-paying jobs in the very industries they were supposed to be regulating.
Oh, right.
The sources call this, rightly, a double standard of justice.
There's an example, right? The CPSC and the lunchboxes.
Yeah, the example of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, and the vinyl lunchboxes is incredibly telling here. The CPSC tested lunchboxes and found dangerously high levels of lead in some one had over 16 times the federal standard.
16 times.
Yeah, but the CPSC didn't warn the public about the high lead levels. Instead, they put out a statement saying they found no instances of hazardous levels and refused to release the original test results, citing regulations designed to protect manufacturers' information.
Well, they covered it up.
Essentially, it took a Freedom of Information Act request to force the actual test results into the open. Those results showed the shockingly high lead content and revealed that the CPSC had used a different, less accurate test method for their public statement.
Unbelievable.
It's a perfect illustration of how weak oversight and prioritizing industry protection can hide real dangers from consumers.
And then there's the broader trend of deregulation.
Right. Efforts, particularly since the Reagan era, have systematically cut budgets for agencies like OSHA, the CPSC, and the FTC, and softened existing regulations. The sources note this played a big role in the massive S&L scandals of the 80s.
Okay.
They argue this isn't just less regulation, it's often unregulation, actively creating conditions where fraud and deviant practices become common, almost normal.
Let's look at some specific and frankly disturbing examples of corporate fraud from the source material. Predatory lending.
Yeah, one area they highlight is predatory lending practices. These aren't just bad loans, they specifically target vulnerable groups, the poor, the elderly, minorities, and women who often have less than perfect credit histories.
And the practices themselves.
Just awful. The detailed practices the sources describe are aggressive marketing, like no credit, no problem, outright falsifying loan applications, adding people as co-signers without their knowledge or consent, giving loans to people who are mentally incapacitated, forging signatures, sneakily changing terms at the closing table.
It keeps going.
Yeah, charging ridiculously high fees and interest rates, using inflated appraisals, excessive penalties for paying off loans early, abusive collection tactics, and even intentionally failing to report good payment history so borrowers' credit can improve.
Sickening.
Yeah.
And briefly revisiting the S&L scandals from this perspective.
Right. The sources point to deregulation enabling widespread collective embezzlement, where insiders essentially stole from the institutions. This was facilitated by accountants, lawyers, and even government officials who looked the other way or actively interfered with investigations. The losses were immense, hundreds of billions, possibly trillions.
And then we saw it again in the early 2000s with the Enron and WorldCom era scandals.
We did. The sources remind us of the massive scale of stock market losses and huge numbers of jobs cut. Companies like Enron simply lied about billions in revenue using complex accounting tricks.
And banks were involved, too.
Yeah, the sources mention that even major banks were implicated, called Enron enablers by the Wall Street Journal, for helping companies hide losses.
And the consequences.
Well, while some executives did go to prison, many didn't. And the firms involved often paid massive fines, like $1.4 billion in one settlement with 10 investment firms without ever admitting guilt, sometimes just rebranding themselves.
And it gets even more pervasive, reaching into everyday life. The sources talk about seemingly legitimate industries where fraud is incredibly common, even built in.
Yeah, think diet and nutrition companies, major auto repair chains, or even those infomercial products like ab cruncher machines or creams claiming to melt away cellulite.
How is that fraud?
Well, the sources frame this as a form of maximization, selling products that simply don't work as advertised, or making wildly misleading claims. It's combining illegal activity, selling something, with deviant or illegal means, deception, all for profit.
Deceptive advertising is presented as a key form of this fraud, essentially a form of theft.
Exactly. You're getting people to hand over their money based on false or misleading claims. The FTC focuses on ads making health or safety claims, or claims that are hard for consumers to verify on their own.
Any specific examples?
Examples range from things like product shrinkage, putting less product in the same size packaging, making consumers implicitly think they're getting the same amount.
Ah, yeah, I've seen that.
to things like children's cough syrups that were marketed for decades despite no scientific evidence they actually worked for kids and could even be dangerous.
Wow.
The sources use this to show how legitimate business, selling syrup, is combined with deviance, deceptive marketing for maximization.
Okay, now let's shift from corporate fraud to corporate violence. The sources reiterate that defective products alone cause vastly more injuries and deaths than street crime.
It's staggering. We're talking about things like toys with lead paint, massive food poisoning outbreaks from contaminated food, dangerous prescription drugs, faulty medical devices, unsafe cars, cribs, and sometimes, shockingly, even after products are recalled as dangerous, they are resold.
And the sources emphasize that this isn't just bad luck or accident.
Not at all. Corporations driven by that profit motive are often negligent, even criminally negligent. This includes failing to do adequate safety testing, knowing about defects and failing to fix them, failing to report dangers to regulators or the public, or even knowingly marketing products they understand are dangerous.
The Ford Pinto case is presented as the absolute textbook example, isn't it?
It really is. Ford's own pre-crash tests showed the fuel tank was likely to rupture in rear-end collisions, essentially turning the car into a death trap.
But they knew.
They knew. But their internal calculation, notoriously using a figure like $200,000 per burn death lawsuit payout, determined it was cheaper not to fix it.
They put a price on a life.
They did. The sources cite the specific numbers from the source table. The calculated benefit of not fixing it, paying out lawsuits, was $49.5 million, while the estimated cost to actually spend $11 per car to fix the defect was $137 million. It was purely a cost-benefit analysis that put profit over human lives.
Awful. And they mentioned Firestone tires having a similar issue in the 1970s.
Yeah, with tread separation problems that led to thousands of accidents and dozens of deaths. Even knowing about the danger, the sources say Firestone continued selling the defective tires, even at clearance prices, and only received a tiny $50,000 fine.
Unbelievable. The sources even frame products like fast food and other overly processed, unhealthy items as defective, in a way.
Yeah, because they cause significant harm when used as intended, meaning eaten regularly. They link corporate practices, the additives, the speed of processing, intense lobbying against public health initiatives, marketing directly to children, promoting overeating directly to rising rates of obesity and related illnesses.
But perhaps the most clear-cut example of a defective product, according to the sources, is cigarettes.
Absolutely. They kill people when used exactly as intended. The sheer scale of death is staggering. 438,000 deaths per year in the U.S. alone.
More than what?
More than HIV, car accidents, suicide, murder, alcohol, and illegal drugs combined. And that doesn't even count the enormous health consequences for smokers and from secondhand smoke, like lung cancer, heart disease, ascites in infants.
And the sources detail the tobacco industry's conduct as a perfect storm of maximization.
Oh, completely. They intentionally misled the public and Congress for decades about addiction and health risks. They purposely marketed to children using characters like Joe Camel.
I remember Joe Camel.
Yeah. They scientifically engineered cigarettes to be more addictive. They attacked critics and funded faulty research to create doubt. They lied under oath.
This is exactly what the sources mean by maximization, then.
Precisely. It's taking a perfectly legal activity, selling cigarettes, and combining it with a deliberate, decades-long pattern of deviant and outright illegal means: deception, manipulation, targeting minors, lying all for extreme profit, knowing full well their product kills hundreds of thousands every year.
And the settlement money.
Yeah, the sources even note how after the massive settlement with the states, much of that money intended for public health was used for things completely unrelated to preventing smoking.
Okay, finally, workplace violence. Again, not someone shooting up the office.
No, this is the violence of unsafe conditions leading to death from occupational illnesses like brown lung from cotton dust, silicosis from silica dust, or black lung from coal dust.
And this is another form of maximization.
That's how the sources describe it. Legal employment is combined with deviant or illegal safety practices, essentially cutting corners on safety because it's cheaper and boosts profits. Managers often prioritize hitting production targets and profit goals over ensuring worker safety.
And the quotas themselves.
And production quotas themselves can contribute to workers taking risks that lead to injury or death. While a worker might know the risks, the sources emphasize the corporation's culpability when their actions are reckless or negligent regarding safety.
Okay, let's bring this back to the really big picture, the question of inequality. The sources point to the absolutely severe income inequality in the U.S. as part of this system.
Yeah, it's stark. Think about this number. Between 2000 and 2005 alone, CEO salaries at major companies grew by 84%, while the average worker's salary fell by 0.3%.
Fell, while CEO pay went up 84%.
Fell 0.3%. The average CEO of a major company can make hundreds of times what their average worker makes. The sources give a stunning comparison. In 2006, the average CEO made about $42,400 per day.
Per day.
Per day. The average worker made about $41,861 per year.
So the CEO was making more in a single day than the average worker made in an entire year.
That's right. And that doesn't even count stock options, bonuses, and massive pension contributions. Private equity and hedge fund managers make vastly more still.
Is this level of disparity justified? What do people think?
Well, the sources point to poll data showing that both the American public and most CEOs themselves actually think CEO salaries are excessive.
Even the CEOs.
Even most CEOs, according to the polls cited.
And from a social justice perspective.
Right. The idea of a fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages in society theorists like John Rawls argue that inequalities are only truly acceptable if everyone has a fair chance at the high positions. Fair quality of opportunity. And D, if those inequalities actually benefit the least advantaged members of society.
Does our current system meet that test?
The sources argue that the current levels of inequality, with such a huge gap and a minimum wage that isn't a living wage, clearly fail this test. Other theorists agree that these disparities are unacceptable and that it doesn't seem like the top pay has actually been earned in a way that benefits everyone.
So, pulling all these threads together, the core argument for the source material is that elite deviance and criminality, particularly within corporations, isn't just random bad acts.
No, it's fundamentally driven by the intense cultural pressure of the American dream's emphasis on material success, combined with the specific additional pressures found within the corporate context. This combination leads to maximization.
Right, the simultaneous use of both legal and deviant or illegal means to pursue profit relentlessly.
Exactly. And it's really crucial, they argue, to see that this isn't just about a few individual bad apples. It's deeply rooted in a corporate culture and a structural design that actively encourages, sometimes even requires, this kind of behavior.
It often pushes individuals to set aside their personal ethics for the sake of corporate profit and maintaining loyalty.
That's the argument.
Do the sources offer any solutions? Briefly.
Yeah, they briefly touch on potential solutions, suggesting we need fundamental shifts. Maybe reprioritizing the welfare of crucial, non-economic parts of society, like families and communities, over the relentless focus on the economy. And crucially, reducing the opportunities for this kind of deviance by significantly increasing regulation, oversight, and applying serious, meaningful sanctions to corporations and executives who break the law.
So, tougher rules, tougher enforcement.
Essentially, yes. Ultimately, the sources paint a picture where, within this system, deviance and crime for profit become disturbingly normalized, blurring the lines between what is seen as legitimate and illegitimate ways to pursue wealth and achieve the American dream.
So this wasn't just an academic exercise in theory. We've gone from that catchy "greed is good" slogan to seeing how that mindset, fueled by the pressures of the American dream and corporate structure and enabled by weak controls, plays out in widespread corporate fraud and violence.
Yeah, and these aren't abstract forces. These are the forces shaping the products you buy, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the kind of economy you live in, and, frankly, the opportunities available to you and everyone around you.
So here's a thought to leave you with, something to mull over. If our society's core structures and values can make pursuing profit through deviance seem like a normal, even expected path, particularly among the most powerful elites, what does that really tell us about the health of our overall systems?
And what role might each of us play, even unintentionally, in reinforcing those very structures?